Aftermath. Let's play hardball. Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews out in San Francisco. Let me start tonight with this. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a white person in this country is 5 times as likely to commit suicide with a gun as to be shot with one. You are more likely to deliberately kill yourself, in other words, with a firearm, than to have someone else deliberately shoot and kill you. Now, pause for this. If you're an African American in this country, you're 5 times as likely to be shot and killed by someone as to do it to yourself. Well, this explains, if you think about this amazing number, and I will admit it's only part of the differing attitudes out there on the Trayvon Martin tragedy, it does explain a vital life and death difference in how we look at and feel about guns in this country. If you are black in America, you see the horror of gun violence up close. You see how guns kill your kids. It's why you may be wondering why your country refuses to take even a minimal step to protect them, your kids, from people having guns who shouldn't. Well, tonight we're going to talk about the overall reaction to the verdict in the Zimmerman murder case. I want to get to what I think are the layers to the case, and there are layers, all which matter to what's happening right now, today in this country. I'm talking about the emotional aftermath. First, and this is a fact, the historic injustice to blacks in this country at the hands of whites. Slavery was a 250-year fact of life on this continent. Jim Crow was a 100-year fact of life. And what's come since the 1960s is a mix of bad and good that fails to offset all that came before. Results of which continue in the relations between white and black right up through the trial and its aftermath. It's all part of the context in which we live. Second is the combination of facts that create the context of the actual tragedy down there in Sanford, Florida. This killing of an African-American teenager. This fact that he pursued, Mr. Zimmerman, a young man, acting like he was a police officer, armed as if he was one, deciding on the guilt of that young man as if he had the rights and duty of a police officer. And it very well, perhaps, because he was carrying that gun, felt like a police officer. Who knows? Who knows? Well, this combination of history and context are the box in which this case came in. Though the jurors were asked to rule on what happened when those two men met up with each other, I don't think it's easily possible to ignore the circumstances of history and George Zimmerman's behavior up till they met that evening. I don't think you can ignore that. I don't think it's possible to view the public reaction right now to the trial's aftermath, apart from those two factors of history and Zimmerman kept bringing a gun into this situation. White America may have been surprised at the jury's decision way back in that other celebrated murder case, the O.J. case, but they did not see it as part of an historic wrong, some pattern of historic injustice. It's plain now, as we watch the reaction, African Americans, and not only them, see the verdict of Saturday night very much in the light of history. Let's talk to two great people. Joy Reid's an MSNBC contributor, and Eugene Robinson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. Before I hear from you two sane people of reasonable judgment, I want to show us the context of what's going on in this country, and it is a disgrace. Take a look at how, well, this isn't a disgrace. Here's an editorial in this morning's USA Today. You can agree with it or not, but it characterized the frustration and anger that many feel. Quote, this is from an unsigned editorial. The fact remains that Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer and cop wannabe, instantly identified Martin as a blanking punk who looks like he's up to no good. Well, the fact remains that Martin was doing nothing wrong. He was returning from a snack run at a convenience store, heading for the house of his father's girlfriend. African Americans saw the case in a way that the jury of 6 women, many of them white, and the other of uncertain ethnicity, probably could not. Despite all the nation's progress in burying its racist past, minorities are commonly stopped by authorities or viewed by strangers as up to no good, for no other reason than the color of their skin. And that's the USA Today editorial. And that comes down somewhere in the middle. Let me start with you folks right now. I want to get to some of the crazier stuff, but you're in the next segment. But let's talk about reasonable reaction. Is it possible, Joy, my friend, is it possible to unlayer this situation from historic injustice, going back to the first slave to get here, all the way through Jim Crow, all the way through the latest police profiling, and separate out the fact that Zimmerman walked into a situation with a gun and perhaps with an attitude, who knows, that he was some kind of pseudo-police officer and he was somehow catching people he thought were the criminals, profiling or not, from the actual question the jury was asked to answer, what happened when these two people met? Who was the aggressor? Who did the defendant feel justified fear of loss of life or serious bodily harm? Can you separate the history, the behavior of Mr. Zimmerman before the incident came about, when they met with each other, from the actual question of guilt or innocence, which the jury was asked to decide?
Well, Chris, I would suggest not. And the reason for that is because since the only account that fully explains what happened on that night comes from George Zimmerman, and he told a lot of untruths in other areas, a lot of untruths about what he was doing that night, even down to whether he was following Trayvon Martin, his account alone is unreliable. Okay, so while there may have been reasonable doubt, believing George Zimmerman's story that Trayvon Martin leapt out from the bushes instead of just going home and decided to slam his head into the concrete, you have to believe that Trayvon Martin would have been scary to you if you are a juror, that he would have been frightening to you. And the defense directly played on that when they showed that picture of Trayvon Martin with the shirt off, the Facebook picture where he's got the gold grill in, and said, this is the person that my client saw. And that whole history and that whole idea of him being not just a regular teenager, but a scary black menace. And then the second part of that
is... So you don't accept the testimony or the evidence from the forensic scientist that he did have evidence of serious injury on his back of his head that may have been caused by cement?
Well, his own physician, the person who examined him, said they were exaggerated. The medical examiner said that there were 2 small cuts. They may have bled a lot, but that they were exaggerated. Chris Serino, the lead detective, said that he believed George Zimmerman exaggerated his injuries, even if they got into a fight. Because here's the question,
well, what happened where did the injuries come from on the back of his head? I'm trying to separate this case out the way the jury did it.
They could have been rolling around on the grass. They could have been rolling around on the concrete. Who knows? Clearly there was some sort of a fight. But George Zimmerman's total account of it, of having his head slammed into the concrete when they wound up in the grass, his own lawyer admitted that, well, maybe he did exaggerate his injuries, and they wound up on the grass. So in the end, his story was contingent upon the fact that Trayvon Martin saw the gun and reached for the gun, and that's why he did it. But
just to finish up, you believe that he was guilty of second-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt. If you were a juror, you would have decided that based on the trial.
I think that they had enough for manslaughter if the prosecutors had done a halfway decent job. I think the prosecutors did a poor job, never established a theory of the case of their own. The same question you're asking, the prosecutor should have answered that. They should have provided a theory, and I'll provide you with at least one possible theory, and this is it. We never could get people to understand the fear somebody would feel if they are a young black teenage male when they have someone following them. I heard a lot of people who were white looking at the case and say, well, he was just following him. What's wrong with that? Well, you know what? It's frightening to be followed. And if he turned around and decided to fight someone, an armed man following him.
Well, he didn't know he was armed. Did he, or did he?
Well, to fight someone who's following him. The idea of somebody following you and then having the right to ask you where you are and what you're doing. There's a history of that in this country.
What's your theory of what happened? When you, in your mind's eye, when you think about what happened, do you have a theory, of a visual theory of them somehow getting into a fight, and this guy not really being justified in the sense of fear of bodily harm or death? I mean, do you have a sense that that didn't meet the condition? How do you see it?
Well, I mean, getting back to your original question of the idea of African Americans being out of place, I think that obviously George Zimmerman decided this kid didn't belong here. There was something wrong with him, as he said, and he decided to follow him, and he caught up to him. And once this person who's following you gets out of their car and is now really following you on foot and catches up to you, does this kid have now a right to maybe fight him? Did he fight him? Did he hit him? That's entirely possible. But it gets back to the question of this history in this country. There used to be a time when not only police could ask any black person on the street, what are you doing here? And you had to answer, but when any civilian could do it too, right? Isn't that the Emmett Till story? Some civilian decides, you don't belong here. Now, you tell me what you're doing here, and then because I am an African-American young black teenager, I have an obligation to answer you. Zimmerman had absolutely no authority to ask that kid what he was doing there, and never even mentioned he was neighborhood watch.
I'm just trying to recognize, I'm trying to get to that. Let me have Gene's take on this. Jane, you know how to write about these things. How do you put it all together? Is it a way to disaggregate the history, the profiling aspect of this, the gun fact of it, from what may have happened or not happened once these two met each other?
Well, that's essentially what the jury was asked to do. The jury was asked to disaggregate the history from what actually happened. I think the justice system failed Trayvon Martin the night he was killed. The police did not conduct a proper investigation that night. They didn't arrest Zimmerman. You know, a grown man acknowledges, I just killed an unarmed 17-year-old kid. They didn't do an investigation. They didn't arrest him. They didn't test him for drug or alcohol use. They did a sort of cursory examination for forensic evidence, and they barely bothered to look for witnesses. So none of that was really done until 6 weeks later. So I can't blame prosecutors that much for trying to work with what they had. Now, the reason the system failed Trayvon Martin that night and continually, I believe, is this sort of dehumanization of black young men, of black boys, boys. I mean, he was a 17-year-old, a teenager, 3 weeks past his 17th birthday. I've had a couple of those in my house, and whatever they might think they are, they're boys. They're not
I think
mature.
You're right. That's
they're not
where
adults.
I agree. I agree in the context of this because they let it drop. The initial reaction we have to keep reminding ourselves of, and I don't like the way the governor down. I don't like that governor anyway down there, Scott, what's his name? Rick Scott. But the fact is the way he jumped in it, and obviously political purpose there. But what I did think it was kind of cold, to put it lightly, to have the Zimmerman talk to the police and then just drop the matter as if this kid wasn't a human being.
Right, and black boys are not allowed to be boys. They're not allowed to be at the cusp of manhood and to make the sort of questionable but not fatal, shouldn't be fatal decisions that kids make at that age. Yet it just seemed okay to the police and the prosecutors initially until there was a national outcry, and then people looked more closely at the case. So if we're going to have a conversation, let's talk about that. Let's talk about black boys and how they are seen as men, as full of menace.
Gene, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm putting you on the spot here because when you watch the trial, like I watched it maybe 2/3 half the time, I had other things to do, like in the news, but I was watching a lot of us with interest. I thought the jury's on its way to an acquittal. I wasn't sure about the manslaughter because I thought that might be a hung jury. I think I'm with Joy on that. I don't know where that would have gone. But I didn't think the prosecution was very competent. I didn't think they had the evidence. Maybe they could have had it. Maybe a genius prosecutor could have done it. But they weren't geniuses. And I think
that the chance of the state developing a sort of dispassionate account of what happened that night, different from Zimmerman's account, an account that would stand up to Zimmerman's account, frankly, was probably lost in the weeks between when the killing took place and when the investigation started. And I think the prosecution was left with a bunch of facts, and they poked a lot of holes into Zimmerman's story. So it's not as if they didn't impeach his story.
Yes.
But I'm not sure it was possible for them to develop a much more coherent narrative because the information simply wasn't there.
That's my
after
question.
That lapse of time.
Joy, last thought to you quickly. Why didn't they try to present a movie in our minds of what happened, favorable to the prosecution?
And I think that's the point, because you were asking all of those questions at the beginning, and I think those are the questions a lot of the jurors were probably asking too. And even down to conceding who was on top, it seems like the prosecutors maybe didn't have a theory of what could have happened, but also culturally, they had to be able to imagine what John Guy said at the very end, that this was a kid who was trying to get home who might have been afraid. I never heard that developed until the very end. It seemed like they found their momentum on the last day, but up until then, they never presented a narrative that could have compelled these 6 women, none of whom had the life experiences or the cultural experiences that an African-American teenager or his parents would have had. None of that. And rather than develop that over the course of the trial, they tried to rush it in at the end. So it really isn't surprising that they lost.
Do you think it's surprising that the prosecution allowed an all-white jury, or 5 out of 6 jurors being white? How did they let that happen? Why did the prosecution let that happen? Why didn't they challenge enough to get a mixed jury?
I have no idea. I mean, I thought that procedure was fairly well established over the last 5 or 6 decades.
I think we get used to that.
You wouldn't, in this sort of case, want a jury that had no African American jurors.
Well, you know what? But
I don't think the prosecution believed in the case. Maybe that's just a seat-of-the-pants view. I don't think they had their heart in it. They didn't have a picture, a story to tell. They didn't have a case to make. Both of you, I agree with. They impeached the witness. They impeached the testimony given through videotape and otherwise testimony, even with the guy not having to sit in the chair, Zimmerman. But I didn't get a sense they had a counter story to tell.
Their own story. Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Thanks. Please come back. You're the best. Of course you're going to come back. You're part of us. Anyway, thanks, Joy. Thank you, Eugene. I can't wait to read you tomorrow. Coming up, the Justice Department is opening a hate crime investigation into Trayvon Martin's case. Let's see how that prospects look. We're going to look at whether the federal government, the prosecution, and the Justice Department can actually bring a case, and will they? Politics will play a part in this, and you'll have to wonder about Eric Holder and what he wants to do. This is Hardball, the place for politics.
This case has never been about race, nor has it ever been about the right to bear arms, not in the sense of proving this as a criminal case. But Trayvon Martin was profiled. There is no doubt that he was profiled to be a criminal. And if race was one of the aspects in George Zimmerman's mind, then we believe that we put out the proof necessary to show that Zimmerman did profile Trayvon Martin.